Some heroes are forged in fire before they ever face the battles that define them. James Hopper entered the world in Hawkins, Indiana, during the 1940s, born into a small town that valued normalcy above all else. The Hopper family belonged to the working class of this quiet Midwestern community, affording young Jim no particular advantages beyond the ordinary comforts of post-war American life. He grew up surrounded by familiar streets, predictable routines, and the kind of stability that small-town existence promised. Among his childhood companions was Joyce Horowitz, a girl from the trailer park whose friendship would prove more enduring than either could have imagined. These early years suggested nothing of the interdimensional horrors he would one day confront. They were simply the foundation, unremarkable in their ordinariness, before everything changed. As the Vietnam War escalated through the 1960s, Hopper made the decision that would define his early manhood. He enlisted, leaving Hawkins behind for the jungles of Southeast Asia. What followed transformed him in ways that peaceful Indiana never could have prepared him for. The combat he witnessed, the violence he participated in, and the deaths he survived created psychological scars that would never fully heal. Hopper learned to kill, learned to survive, learned to function in conditions that broke other men completely. These were not lessons any young man should have needed. They showed a world far darker than Hawkins had ever acknowledged existed. When he returned from Vietnam, Hopper found himself unable to remain in the town that had raised him. The familiar streets felt suffocating, the predictable routines meaningless after what he had seen. He moved to New York City, seeking something he could not have named. There he joined the police force, rising through the ranks to become a detective. His natural tenacity, combined with skills honed in combat, made him effective at investigative work. Colleagues recognized him as relentless, physical, and unafraid of confrontation. During these New York years, he met Diane, a woman who saw past his rough edges to something worth loving. They married, building what appeared to be a stable life in the chaos of the city. From humble Midwestern beginnings, through the trauma of war to the gritty reality of New York law enforcement, Hopper had constructed an identity built on toughness and determination. The boy who had played in Hawkins had become a man who understood darkness in ways most people never would. These formative years, marked by combat and investigation, provided tools that would prove essential. But the true test of Hopper's character would come not from human enemies, but from something far more personal and devastating than any war. Yet even as Hopper built his career in New York's precincts, the greatest joy and deepest tragedy of his life was approaching. The strongest foundations can crumble when grief becomes the architect. The marriage between Jim Hopper and Diane appeared, to outside observers, to be built on solid ground. Two people who had found each other in the vastness of New York City, who had created partnership from the chaos that surrounded them. When their daughter Sarah was born, something shifted in Hopper that he had not anticipated. The hardened detective, the Vietnam veteran who had learned to suppress emotion as a survival mechanism, discovered a capacity for love that terrified him with its intensity. Sarah became the center of his existence, the single, unambiguous good in a life that had known too much darkness. Every moment with her felt like redemption for things he had done in the war, for violence he had witnessed on city streets. The cancer diagnosis arrived without warning, as such catastrophes always do. Childhood leukemia, the doctors explained with clinical precision. Treatable, they said, though the treatments themselves would be brutal. Hopper watched his daughter endure chemotherapy, radiation, hospital stays that stretched into weeks. He was a man who had faced armed enemies, who had survived combat situations that should have killed him. Yet he could do nothing against the invisible enemy consuming his child from within. The helplessness was worse than any battlefield fear. Every medical procedure, every setback, every false hope crushed him in ways bullets never had. Sarah died after months of fighting. The exact details of her final moments would remain forever seared into Hopper's memory, though he rarely spoke of them to anyone. What followed was not grief, but complete systematic collapse. The man who had survived Vietnam, who had worked New York's most dangerous precincts, who had prided himself on toughness, simply broke. He turned to pills first, then alcohol, then a combination of both that should have killed him. The substances offered no real relief, only temporary numbness, but numbness was the only state he could tolerate. Diane watched her husband disappear into this chemical fog, watched him become someone she no longer recognized. Her own grief was profound, but she processed it differently, and the chasm between them widened with each passing week. The marriage ended not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet dissolution. Diane left, unable to bear watching Hopper destroy himself, unable to save someone who no longer wanted saving. The divorce papers arrived at an apartment he barely remembered renting. He signed them in a haze of pills and whiskey. Everything that had mattered was gone. His daughter, his wife, his sense of purpose. The detective work continued mechanically, but he was hollowed out, a shell performing functions without investment. Colleagues noticed but said nothing, or said things Hopper never heard through his chemical insulation. He existed in a state that was not quite living, sustained only by his body's stubborn refusal to shut down, despite his best efforts to force it. Some men hit rock bottom and bounced back. Hopper hit rock bottom and kept digging, searching for a depth of pain that might finally exceed his capacity to feel it. What he found instead was a different kind of void. The realization that he could continue indefinitely in this state. That survival required no particular will or purpose, that he could be technically alive while functionally dead. From the wreckage of his New York life emerged a man hollowed by loss, held together by substances and stubbornness. The detective who had once solved murders could not solve the mystery of how to continue living. Hawkins, Indiana, the small town he had escaped decades earlier, offered not redemption, but refuge, a place to hide from the man he had become. The return to Hawkins in the late 1970s appeared to be a retreat, a former detective taking an easy job as small-town police chief. None could have known that this quiet Indiana town concealed secrets that would demand everything Hopper had left to give. Monsters rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They slip through cracks in reality while ordinary people sleep. By November 1983, Jim Hopper had established himself as Hawkins's police chief for several years. The position suited his reduced ambitions perfectly. Small-town law enforcement involved disputes over property lines, teenagers drinking in the woods, and the occasional domestic disturbance. Nothing that required the skills he had developed in New York. Nothing that disturbed the chemical equilibrium he maintained through pills and alcohol. His officers respected him out of habit, though they recognized the distance he kept from genuine engagement with anything. The town saw him as competent enough, reliable in his way, if somewhat detached and cynical. None suspected the depth of his internal damage, or that he approached each day as an exercise in simply not dying. The evening of November 6, 1983, shattered this carefully maintained numbness. Will Byers, a 12-year-old boy, vanished while riding his bicycle home from a friend's house. The initial report came from Joyce Byers, the same Joyce who had been Joyce Horowitz in their childhood. Now a single mother, working multiple jobs to support her two sons. Hopper responded with the mechanical efficiency he brought to all calls, expecting the usual outcome. Lost children in Hawkins were typically found within hours, scared but unharmed, having gotten turned around in the woods or decided to sleep at a friend's house without permission. But Will Byers did not appear within hours. His bicycle was found abandoned on a roadside. His mother's house showed signs of his panicked arrival and sudden departure. Joyce insisted something terrible had happened, insisted with an intensity that most dismissed as maternal hysteria. Hopper found himself unable to dismiss it. Perhaps it was their childhood connection, or perhaps some investigative instinct recognized genuine terror beneath her panic. He began treating the disappearance not as a lost child case, but as something more serious. The investigation led in unexpected directions. While searching the woods near where Will disappeared, Hopper and his officers encountered a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, wearing a hospital gown and soaking wet. Her head was shaved, she refused to speak, and she seemed terrified of any adult authority. When asked her name, she could only show them a tattoo on her wrist, the number So11. Someone had done this to a child, marked her like property, and sent her running into the November woods in inadequate clothing. The questions this raised pointed toward institutional abuse, possibly from Hawkins National Laboratory, the Department of Energy facility on the outskirts of town. Hawkins' lab had always existed at the edge of town consciousness, a classified research facility that employed local workers but shared nothing of its actual activities. Dr. Martin Brenner, the facility's director, appeared almost immediately after Hopper began investigating connections between the girl and Will's disappearance. Brenner was smooth, authoritative, and completely unhelpful. He denied any knowledge of the girl, denied any connection to Will Byers, and politely suggested that local law enforcement should focus on local matters while leaving federal facilities to federal oversight. Every bureaucratic door Hopper tried to open closed before he could reach it. The obstruction only intensified Hopper's suspicion. His detective instincts, dormant for years, began reactivating. He started investigating the lab more aggressively, interviewing workers who hinted at strange experiments, unusual activities, and a pervasive culture of secrecy backed by government authority. Meanwhile, the girl they had found, now staying with Mike Wheeler's family, and identified only as 11, demonstrated abilities that defied rational explanation. She could move objects without touching them, could locate people through psychic connection, could do things that should not have been possible. As the search for Will Byers extended into days, other disturbing developments emerged. Barbara Holland, a teenage girl and friend of Nancy Wheeler, also vanished. Her car was found abandoned near the same woods, her parents frantic with fear. 2 missing children in a town that had known virtually no serious crime suggested something systematic rather than coincidental. Hopper's investigation grew more desperate and less concerned with legal procedure. He broke into Hawkins' lab one night with his officer Powell, discovered evidence of human experimentation, child test subjects, and research into something called the Upside Down, a parallel dimension accessible through a gate the lab had torn open beneath their facility. The truth, when it fully revealed itself, was worse than any crime Hopper had investigated in New York. The girl called 11 had been raised in the lab, trained as a psychic, weapon, subjected to experiments that gave her extraordinary abilities at the cost of any normal childhood. Dr. Brenner had pushed her to make contact with a creature from another dimension during one such experiment. The contact had created a rift between worlds, and something had come through. A predator from this other realm, hunting in Hawkins, while the lab frantically tried to contain the situation they had created. Will Byers had been taken by this creature, dragged into the Upside Down, through one of several gates that had opened around Hawkins. He was alive, but trapped in a nightmare dimension, slowly being consumed by the environment itself. Joyce had been right all along. Her son had not run away, had not gotten lost. He had been pulled into another reality by a monster that should not have existed. Hopper descended into the Upside Down, wearing a hazmat suit, accompanied by Joyce Byers, to retrieve Will from that toxic alternate dimension. What he found there would have broken his younger self completely. A place of rot and decay where everything familiar was twisted into corruption, where the air itself was poisonous, where a creature hunted with predatory intelligence. But Hopper was no longer the man who had broken after Sarah's death. He had nothing left to lose. which made him capable of walking directly into nightmare without hesitation. They found Will in the upside down, barely alive, covered in a membrane that was slowly digesting him. Hopper pulled him free, carried him back through the gate, delivered him to paramedics who somehow brought the boy back from the edge of death. The Demogorgon, as the kids called the creature, was destroyed through Eleven's sacrifice, apparently taking her with it. The gate was encountered but not permanently closed. Dr. Brenner survived, along with most of the lab infrastructure. The aftermath required negotiation. Hopper made a deal with the surviving lab officials, a compromise that tasted like betrayal but achieved practical goals. He would not expose their experiments to the world, would not reveal the Upside Down's existence to broader authorities, would not destroy them as they deserved to be destroyed. In exchange, they would leave Joyce and the kids alone, would provide resources to monitor the situation, and would work to ensure no further breaches occurred. It was not justice. It was pragmatic damage control, executed by a man who understood that ideal solutions rarely existed in the real world. The gate had been encountered but not closed, the monster faced but not destroyed, and the lab's secrets exposed but not eliminated. Hopper had saved one boy and discovered a girl with impossible abilities. In doing so, he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The comfortable numbness of his grief-soaked existence had been shattered by something worse than loss: responsibility. With Will Byers home and the immediate crisis resolved, Hawkins returned to an illusion of normalcy, but Hopper recognized the signs of an unfinished threat. And in the woods outside town, a young girl with a shaved head and powers beyond comprehension needed protection from those who would use her as a weapon. The most dangerous commitments are those we make not from duty, but from recognition of ourselves in another's eyes. Hopper found 11 in the woods during the winter following the Demogorgon incident. She had survived her confrontation with the creature, though exactly how remained unclear even to her. The lab had collapsed in the immediate aftermath, but Hopper knew their interest in recovering their escaped experiment would not end simply because Brenner was gone. New administrators would arrive, new programs would launch, and 11 would remain their primary target. She could not return to a normal life, could not integrate into society with her abilities and lack of any documentation proving she existed. The solution Hopper devised was simple in concept, brutal in execution. His grandfather's old cabin sat isolated in the woods, several miles outside Hawkins, accessible only by a single overgrown road. The structure was barely habitable, lacking modern amenities, but it offered what 11 needed most: invisibility. Hopper moved her in with supplies salvaged from his own apartment and purchases made with careful attention to leaving no traceable pattern. No one could know she had survived. Not the lab, not her friends at school, not anyone who might inadvertently reveal her location. The rules he established were strict to the point of cruelty. 11 could not leave the cabin. She could not be seen through windows. She could not use her powers where anyone might notice. She could not contact her friends, especially Mike Wheeler, whose desperation to find her made him a security risk. The curtains stayed drawn at all times. The door remained locked when Hopper was not present. Her entire existence compressed into a few hundred square feet of hidden space, while the world believed her dead. What followed was a year of enforced isolation that tested them both. Hopper visited daily, bringing food, supplies, and grudging attempts at human connection. He was not equipped to be a parent, had no template for how to care for a traumatized child with supernatural abilities who had never experienced anything resembling normal family life. His methods were heavy-handed, his rules inflexible, his patience limited. 11 resented the confinement, resented his authority, resented the walls that kept her from the friends who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Their conflicts escalated through the months. 11 wanted to see Mike, wanted to attend school, wanted anything beyond the television programs and frozen waffles that constituted her entire world. Hopper refused every request, citing security concerns that were legitimate but felt like prison to a girl who had spent her first 12 years in a laboratory cage. She tested his rules, used her powers to unlock doors, attempted to leave when he was not watching. He responded with anger, fear disguised as discipline, threats to abandon her entirely if she could not follow his instructions. Yet beneath the dysfunction, something unexpected developed. Hopper found himself caring about whether she ate properly, whether she was learning from the books he brought, whether she was safe during the hours he could not be with her. The protective instincts he thought had died with Sarah began reasserting themselves, focused now on this strange child who reminded him of everything he had failed to protect before. 11, for her part, began to see past his gruffness to the fear that motivated it. She learned his patterns, learned to interpret his moods, learned that his anger was usually terror, that he would lose her as he had lost his daughter. The arrival of Dr. Sam Owens at Hawkins' lab complicated their fragile equilibrium. Owens had been sent to replace the disgraced previous administration, tasked with investigating what had gone wrong and ensuring no further breaches occurred. Unlike Brenner, Owens projected reasonableness rather than menace, presenting himself as someone who wanted to help rather than control. Hopper distrusted this performance, but recognized that Owens might provide resources they needed. An alliance formed, built on mutual understanding that the gate beneath the lab remained a threat to everyone. Through Owens, Hopper learned that the situation was worse than he had understood. The gate had not been properly sealed after Will's rescue. It had been closed but not eliminated, and it was growing. Small tears were opening throughout Hawkins, creating connections to the Upside Down that allowed its corruption to bleed into reality. Will Byers himself had become a conduit, infected by his time in that dimension, experiencing visions and episodes that suggested something was using him as a window. By October 1984, Will's condition deteriorated catastrophically. The visions intensified, he began losing time, and something was clearly possessing him. The entity they came to call the Mind Flayer, a massive creature of pure darkness from the Upside Down, had infected Will during his captivity and now used him as a spy in the real world. Every plan to fight it, every attempt to seal the gate, Will inadvertently betrayed because the Mind Flayer could access his thoughts and memories. Hawkins' lab attempted to burn the infection out of Will through induced hypothermia, a brutal process that nearly killed him and ultimately failed. The Mind Flayer's presence in him was too deeply integrated. Meanwhile, the gate beneath the lab continued expanding, and creatures from the Upside Down began emerging in greater numbers. Demodogs, adolescent versions of the creature they had fought before, attacked the lab itself. Bob Newby, Joyce's boyfriend, and a fundamentally decent man who had no understanding of what he had stumbled into, died during the evacuation, torn apart by demodogs while ensuring others could escape. Hopper watched Bob die, watched Joyce lose someone who had made her happy, and understood that the violence was escalating beyond anyone's control. Dr. Owens proposed the only solution that might work: close the gate permanently using 11's abilities. She was the one who had originally opened it through her psychic contact with the Demogorgon. She alone possessed sufficient power to seal it completely. The plan required Hopper and 11 to descend into the depths of Hawkins' lab, fight through whatever creatures emerged from the gate, and reach the rift itself so she could close it psychically. This meant exposing her existence to lab personnel, ending their year of hiding, risking her capture by the same forces that had created her. Hopper made the decision, knowing it might destroy everything he had built to protect her. But Bob's death had clarified the essential truth. Protecting 11 meant nothing if the Upside Down consumed Hawkins entirely. They descended together into the gate chamber, A massive tunnel burrowed into the earth beneath the lab, where the dimensional rift pulsed with sickening energy. Vines from the upside down covered every surface, organic and hostile, responding to their presence with malevolent intelligence. Hopper protected Eleven's physical body while she extended her consciousness to engage with the gate itself, pouring her psychic strength into forcing the rift closed. The effort nearly killed her. Closing the gate required power beyond anything she had previously attempted, demanded she push past every limit Brenner had ever tested. The psychic strain manifested physically, blood pouring from her nose and eyes, her body convulsing with the force of what she was attempting. But she succeeded. The rift sealed with a burst of force that shook the entire lab complex. The Mind Flayer's connection to Will severed instantly, freeing him from possession. The Upside Down was once again separated from reality. As the gate sealed with a burst of psychic force, Hopper watched 11 collapse from the effort. In that moment, carrying her unconscious form from the depths of the lab, he understood what had happened over the past year. The girl he had hidden to keep safe had become the daughter he thought he would never have again. The ghosts of Sarah and Diane still haunted him, but they no longer defined him. Purpose had returned in the form of a telekinetic child who called him Hop. The gate's closure brought temporary peace to Hawkins. Dr. Owens made good on his promise, producing paperwork that made Jane Hopper a legal citizen, a child who officially belonged to the gruff police chief. For 8 months, Hopper experienced something he had nearly forgotten: family. But in the sealed laboratories beneath Starcourt Mall, Russian scientists worked to accomplish what their American counterparts had failed to maintain. They were opening the gate again. Ordinary moments of fatherhood become precious when darkness gathers at the edges of summer. The summer of 1985 brought changes to the Hopper household that Jim found both wonderful and terrifying. 11, now legally Jane Hopper, lived openly with him for the first time. She attended school events, socialized with friends, and experienced the normal teenage activities that had been impossible during their year in hiding. The domestic routine of parenting challenged him in ways Vietnam and detective work never had. Meals required planning, school forms needed signatures, teenage emotions demanded navigation. He was spectacularly bad at most of it, defaulting to gruff authority when patience and understanding would have served better. The primary source of conflict was Mike Wheeler, the boy who had hidden 11 in his basement during her first escape from the lab. Had developed a romantic attachment to her, and she reciprocated with teenage intensity. They spent every available moment together, usually in Hopper's cabin, usually with the door to her room suspiciously closed. Hopper understood intellectually that this was normal adolescent behavior. Emotionally, he wanted to throw Mike Wheeler through a wall. The kid was in his house constantly, monopolizing his daughter's attention, representing everything Hopper did not know how to handle about raising a teenage girl. His response was characteristically subtle, which is to say, not subtle at all. He confronted Mike directly, delivering what he later described as a heart-to-heart conversation, but what was actually a series of barely veiled threats about respecting boundaries and limiting time together. The talk succeeded only in making Mike terrified and 11 furious. She recognized Hopper's interference, saw his controlling behavior as a return to the isolation of the cabin year, and rebelled with escalating defiance. Their conflicts became louder, more frequent, and more destructive to the fragile domestic peace they had achieved. While Hopper struggled with fatherhood, his relationship with Joyce Byers remained complicated by decades of history and recent trauma. They had shared too much, survived too many impossible situations for their connection to remain simple friendship. Hopper made clumsy attempts at something more, suggesting dinner at Enzo's, the nicest restaurant Hawkins offered. The date, when it finally occurred, was catastrophically bad. His nervousness manifested as aggression, Her stress from parenting and work made her defensive, and they barely survived appetizers before abandoning the attempt. Neither was equipped for normal romantic interaction after everything they had experienced. The domestic drama obscured more dangerous developments. Strange things were happening around Hawkins that summer, anomalies that Hopper initially dismissed as unrelated to previous crises. Magnets were losing their magnetism, rats behaved strangely, and electromagnetic interference disrupted electronics throughout town. These phenomena seemed mundane compared to interdimensional monsters, but they shared a common source that would soon reveal itself. The revelation came through unlikely channels. Dustin Henderson, one of the kids who had helped during the Demogorgon crisis, intercepted a Russian communication while testing a radio tower he had built. The message was encrypted, but clearly not American in origin. Further investigation by the kids revealed something that seemed impossible. Russians were in Hawkins, operating covertly beneath the recently opened Starcourt Mall, conducting activities that generated the electromagnetic interference affecting the town. When Hopper learned of this discovery, initially through Joyce, who had been helping the kids investigate, his first response was skepticism. Russian spies in Indiana seemed absurd. Cold War paranoia displaced into an era where such threats should have been obsolete. But the evidence was compelling. The mall's construction had been funded through suspicious shell corporations. Its design included areas inaccessible to normal customers, and the electromagnetic readings emanating from beneath it matched no legitimate commercial purpose. Investigation required infiltration. Hopper, Joyce, and Murray Bauman, a conspiracy theorist who had previously helped expose some of the lab's activities, developed a plan to access the underground facility. What they discovered there validated their worst fears. The Russians had constructed a massive base beneath Starcourt, investing enormous resources into a project that made sense only if they knew about the gate, about the Upside Down, about everything Hawkins' lab had tried to keep secret. The purpose of the Russian operation became horrifyingly clear when they penetrated deeper into the facility. The massive device at the base's center was a key, a machine designed to tear open the dimensional barrier between reality and the Upside Down. The Americans had closed their gate, so the Soviets were opening their own, gambling that they could control and weaponize access to this other dimension. They were succeeding. The machine had already created a small rift, and with each activation, it grew larger, more stable, more capable of allowing things through. This explained everything. The electromagnetic interference, the strange animal behavior, even the feeling of wrongness that permeated Hawkins that summer. The Russians were actively ripping open the barrier that 11 had sacrificed so much to close, and with the gate reopening, the Mind Flayer was returning. The Mind Flayer's strategy this time was more sophisticated than mere possession. It infected multiple Hawkins residents simultaneously, turning them into extensions of its consciousness, while maintaining enough of their original personalities to avoid immediate detection. These flayed individuals appeared normal, but answered to a collective intelligence directing them toward a single purpose: locating and eliminating 11, the only being capable of closing the gate again. Billy Hargrove, Max Mayfield's stepbrother and a local lifeguard, became the primary host. The Mind Flayer transformed him into something between puppet and willing servant, using his existing anger and resentment as fuel for its purpose. Through Billy, it gathered other flayed individuals, building a small army while simultaneously consuming them to construct a physical form in the real world. The creature that had existed only psychically in Will was becoming tangible, growing in the abandoned steelworks, preparing to manifest fully once the gate opened wide enough. 11 discovered Billy's possession through psychic contact, experienced the Mind Flayer's hatred directly, and understood the scale of what was coming. She had lost her powers during the psychic battle with Billy, her abilities seemingly burned out from overuse and strain. Without her powers, she could not close the gate. Without closing the gate, the Mind Flayer would eventually overwhelm Hawkins entirely. The situation was deteriorating toward inevitable catastrophe. Hopper, Joyce, and Murray's assault on the Russian facility became the only option for stopping the crisis. If they could destroy the key, shut down the machine opening the gate, the Mind Flayer would be severed from its power source. 11 and the kids fought the physical manifestation above ground at Starcourt Mall. Hopper and Joyce fought through Russian guards below ground to reach the key's control room. These separate battles, connected by the same enemy and the same desperate goal, represented their last chance to prevent the Upside Down from consuming everything. The fight through the Russian base was brutal and ugly. Hopper had learned violence in Vietnam, refined it as a New York detective, and now deployed it with the desperation of a man who understood failure meant death for everyone he cared about. Guards fell to his physical rage, his willingness to break them with his bare hands when ammunition ran low. Joyce kept pace beside him, proving that maternal fury could match combat training when necessary. Murray, despite his lack of military experience, killed when required because the alternative was worse. They reached the control room where the key's operators worked, maintaining the machine that was tearing reality apart. Hopper fought the chief scientist, a man named Grigory, who matched him in size and exceeded him in trained brutality. Their fight ranged across the control platform, while the key hummed with catastrophic energy below them. Above ground, 11 and the kids barely survived the Mind Flayer's assault, saved only by Billy's final moment of resistance, when some remnant of his humanity reasserted itself long enough to sacrifice his life protecting them. As Hopper struggled with Grigory, Joyce reached the control panel. The key, switches that would shut down the machine, collapse the gate, and sever the Mind Flayer's connection were right there. But so was Hopper, still fighting below the platform in the direct path of the explosion that would result from emergency shutdown. She looked at him through the reinforced window. He looked back. They both understood the mathematics. The machine had to be destroyed. The gate had to close. Someone had to stay behind to ensure it happened. Hopper nodded once. Joyce Byers' hand hovered over the keys, tears streaming down her face. As Hopper nodded once, she turned the keys. The machine exploded, and James Hopper vanished in a burst of Soviet engineering and interdimensional energy. The police chief of Hawkins, Indiana, father, protector, and reluctant hero was gone. Or so it appeared. Survival sometimes requires becoming something harder than the man you once were. The truth of what happened in that final moment beneath Starcourt Mall was more complex than simple death. As Joyce turned the keys and the key began its catastrophic shutdown, Hopper understood he had perhaps 3 seconds before the explosion reached him. 3 seconds to make a choice that most men would have spent frozen in terror. His combat training, the survival instincts carved into him by Vietnam and sharpened by years of facing impossible situations, activated with absolute clarity. There was no time to reach the ladder, no possibility of outrunning the blast. But there was the gate itself, the unstable rift the machine had torn open, pulsing with dimensional energy just meters away. Hopper dove through the gate as the machine exploded behind him. The transition felt like being torn apart and reassembled simultaneously, every nerve screaming as he crossed between dimensions. He emerged not in the Upside Down's poisonous mirror of Hawkins, but somewhere else entirely. The Russians had been opening their own gate, and its other side led not to the version of the Upside Down he had entered before, but to their facility in Kamchatka, Russia, on the eastern edge of Soviet territory. He materialized directly into the hands of Russian soldiers guarding their side of the portal. There was no fight, no dramatic last stand. He appeared wounded, disoriented, and outnumbered by trained troops who had been waiting for exactly this kind of emergence. They captured him immediately, identifying him as American from his clothing and language, uncertain whether he was spy or victim, but certain he was valuable. The transport to Kamchatka's prison facility took days, much of it spent in a drugged stupor, as his Soviet captors ensured his compliance. When he regained full consciousness, he found himself in a cell that redefined his understanding of bleakness. The prison existed in one of the most remote regions on Earth, surrounded by frozen tundra that would kill any escapee long before they reached civilization. The facility housed political prisoners, criminals, and others the Soviet state wished to disappear completely. Hopper was designated the American, kept initially separate from the general prison population, while his captors debated his fate. Some argued for immediate execution. Others wanted interrogation, convinced he must be CIA or military intelligence to have appeared through their secret dimensional research program. The debate extended through weeks while he sat in isolation. The Kamchatka winter, seeping through inadequate walls, bringing cold that made upstate New York feel tropical by comparison. The decision eventually reached was practical rather than merciful. They would keep him alive as potential leverage or information source, but he would endure the same conditions as other prisoners. This meant transfer to the general population, forced labor in sub-zero temperatures, and the daily brutality that characterized Soviet penal philosophy. Survival required immediate adaptation. The other prisoners, a mix of Russian criminals and political dissidents, tested him within hours of his arrival. A former police chief who had fought monsters meant nothing here. Only physical capability and willingness to respond to violence with greater violence mattered. Hopper's combat experience served him well. The fights were ugly, brutal, and won not through technique, but through absolute refusal to stop until his opponents did. He established himself as someone too dangerous to casually victimize, though this brought its own problems. Respect in a gulag came with expectations. The prison's internal hierarchy demanded he participate in its violence, enforce its codes, become complicit in the system, even as he suffered within it. The labor was designed to break men systematically. Prisoners worked building a railroad across frozen ground, chipping at earth that resisted every blow, dragging materials through snow and ice, driven by guards who viewed them as disposable resources. The mortality rate was high. Men died from exposure, from exhaustion, from injuries untreated by the minimal medical facilities. Their bodies were noted in ledgers and forgotten immediately. Through these months of hell, Hopper clung to a single thought that kept him from the despair that claimed other prisoners. 11 believed he was dead. Joyce believed he was dead. They would be grieving him, and he could not bear the idea that they would suffer that loss unnecessarily. He had to survive, had to escape, had to find a way back to prove he was alive. The rage this generated, the absolute refusal to accept permanent imprisonment, became the core of his continued existence. The winter stretched across 8 months, though time became difficult to track in the monotonous cycle of cold, labor, and violence. Hopper attempted escape 3 times, each effort ending in recapture and punishment that should have discouraged further attempts. But he had learned something about himself through these failures. He could endure anything if it moved him closer to his goal. Pain was temporary, cold was manageable. Imprisonment was only permanent if you accepted it as such. Among the guards was Dmitry Antonov, called Enzo by the other prisoners, a man whose conscience had not yet been completely destroyed by his role in the system. Antonov watched the American prisoner with growing respect, recognizing a fellow human being rather than merely another number. Their initial conversations were cautious, testing whether trust could exist in an environment designed to make it impossible. Hopper offered nothing at first, certain this was another interrogation technique. But Antonov proved sincere in his growing disgust with the prison's brutality. He had a son in Moscow, a family he sent money to, a life outside these walls that reminded him of his own humanity. The American represented something he could do that might balance the horrors he participated in daily. A single act of decency in an ocean of cruelty. The other crucial figure was Yuri Ismailov, a smuggler and pilot who worked the black market routes around Kamchatka, moving contraband for prison guards and criminal organizations with equal enthusiasm. Yuri cared for nothing except profit, but profit meant he would help anyone who could pay. Antonov knew him, knew his roots, knew his price. Together, they represented the components of a possible escape if contact could be made with the outside world. Hopper gave Antonov the phone number for Murray Bauman in America, the conspiracy theorist who had helped storm the Starcourt facility. It was a desperate gamble. The number might no longer work. Murray might not answer calls from unknown Russian sources. Even if contact succeeded, mounting a rescue operation into the Soviet Union's most remote prison seemed impossible. But impossible had stopped meaning unavailable to Hopper months ago. 8 months of frozen hell had stripped away whatever remained of the man who had worried about curfews and teenage dating. The Hopper who survived Kamchatka was a weapon honed by necessity, kept sharp by rage and sustained by a single thought. 11 believed he was dead. Joyce believed he was dead. He would endure anything to prove them wrong. But first he would have to survive what the Soviets kept locked beneath the prison, something that had also come through the gate. In their hubris, the Soviets had captured more than an American lawman. They had imprisoned pieces of the Upside Down itself, keeping captive demogorgons to study and weaponize. Hopper's path to freedom would require walking directly into the nightmare he thought he had escaped. Freedom's price is sometimes paid in the blood of monsters and men alike. The Soviets' research program beneath Kamchatka prison extended beyond simply opening gates to the Upside Down. They had captured specimens, brought them through before the gate closed, and maintained them in containment for study and potential weaponization. Among these specimens were several demogorgons, the creatures Hopper had fought in Hawkins, kept in reinforced cells, and brought out for experiments that tested their capabilities and weaknesses. The prisoners learned about these creatures through rumour and the occasional screaming that echoed from beneath the facility. The guards called it the arena, a testing ground where the Soviets studied how the demogorgons hunted, how they could be controlled or directed, what weapons proved effective against them. What the prisoners did not fully understand until the selections began was their own role in this research program. Men disappeared from the general population periodically, chosen by guards according to criteria that seemed random but followed prison politics. Troublemakers went first, then those who had exhausted their usefulness, then eventually anyone expendable. They were taken below and did not return. Hopper understood what this meant long before his own selection came. The Soviets were using prisoners as live targets, feeding them to captured monsters to gather data on hunting behavior and killing efficiency. When the guards came for him, Hopper did not resist. Resistance meant being dragged unconscious, arriving at the arena with no opportunity to prepare mentally. He walked to his scheduled death with the same grim determination he had brought to every other impossible situation. The arena itself was exactly what he expected: a large circular room, reinforced walls, observation windows, where scientists and military officials watched safely from above, and a cage at one end where something massive moved in darkness. The demogorgon they released was a mature specimen, larger than the ones he had encountered in Hawkins, kept hungry enough to be immediately aggressive. When the cage opened and it emerged, Hopper recognized the wrongness of its existence instantly. The creature was muscle and teeth wrapped in alien biology, its head splitting open to reveal concentric circles of fangs, its movements combining inhuman speed with predatory intelligence. He survived the first encounter through combat instincts and sheer luck. The arena's floor was littered with debris from previous fights, including a metal bar that served as weapon. Hopper used it to keep the creature at distance, targeting its opened mouth when it attacked, causing enough pain to make it cautious. The Demogorgon was dangerous, but not invincible. It could be hurt, could be frightened, could be driven back if you were willing to meet its aggression with greater violence. The guards ended the fight after several minutes, recaging the creature and returning Hopper to his cell. He had proven something valuable. He could face the monster and not simply die. This made him useful for extended study. Over the following weeks, he was brought to the arena repeatedly, sometimes alone, sometimes with other prisoners who had also survived initial encounters. They learned to coordinate, developed tactics for fighting the Demogorgon as a team, discovered its vulnerabilities through brutal trial and error. Each fight cost someone. Men died in the arena regularly, torn apart when they made mistakes or when the creature simply proved faster than human reaction time could manage. Hopper survived through advantages others lacked. His experience with these creatures in Hawkins meant he understood their hunting patterns. His combat training gave him tactical thinking under pressure. Most importantly, his absolute refusal to accept death kept him moving when others froze. During one fight, the prison guards brought a different tool to the arena. A sword, Russian military issue, heavy and brutally practical. Hopper claimed it immediately, recognizing that reach and cutting power gave him better odds than improvised weapons. With the sword, the arena fights shifted from desperate survival to something approaching actual combat. He could wound the Demogorgon seriously, could drive it back, could even kill it if the guards allowed the fight to continue long enough. But the arena was only one component of his imprisonment. Throughout these months, Dmitry Antonov maintained contact with Murray Bauman in America. The conversations were necessarily cryptic, conducted through intermediaries and coded language to avoid Soviet intelligence detection. Murray, upon learning Hopper was alive, made contact with Joyce Byers. Together, they began planning the impossible, infiltrating the Soviet Union, reaching Kamchatka prison, and extracting Hopper before he died in the arena or from exposure. The operation required Yuri Ismailov's cooperation, bought with promises of American cash and safe passage out of Russia. Yuri agreed, motivated purely by profit, but reliable in his way. He would transport Joyce and Murray into Soviet airspace, land near Kamchatka, and extract them plus Hopper if they survived long enough to reach the rendezvous point. The risks were catastrophic, the chance of success minimal, but Joyce had walked into the Upside Down to save Will, and would walk into Soviet Russia to save Hopper without hesitation. Their arrival in Kamchatka coincided with one of Hopper's arena fights. While he battled the Demogorgon below ground, Joyce and Murray worked with Antonov above to create the chaos necessary for prison break. The plan was improvised, violent, and relied on using the prison's own monsters against its guards. If they could release the Demogorgon during the break, it would focus guard attention while they escaped. The execution went badly from the start, as all plans do when they meet reality. Guards discovered the conspiracy, shots were fired, and the prison went into lockdown before Hopper even knew rescue was attempting. But the chaos achieved one crucial goal. It opened the cages. The Demogorgon, freed from containment during the fighting, rampaged through the facility with all the rage of something that had been imprisoned and tormented for months. Hopper encountered Joyce in a corridor, both of them running from different threats, and the reunion was everything and nothing like either had imagined. There was no time for emotion, only brief acknowledgements that she had come for him, that he was alive, and that they would celebrate these facts only if they survived the next several minutes. They ran together through the prison, while the Demogorgon killed everything in its path, using the creature's rampage as both distraction and clearing force. The escape route led through the facility's upper levels, where Yuri waited with his helicopter, engines running, seconds from abandoning the mission entirely. The group converged, running and fighting through guards who were more focused on containing the Demogorgon than stopping fleeing prisoners. Murray provided covering fire with characteristic manic enthusiasm. Antonov made the split-second decision to come with them, burning his bridges with the Soviet state, rather than face consequences for his betrayal. They lifted off from Kamchatka, with the prison facility erupting into chaos below them. The Demogorgon had killed dozens, destroyed containment systems, and potentially freed other specimens in its rampage. The Soviets' hubris in capturing and studying creatures from the Upside Down had resulted in exactly the catastrophic failure such hubris deserved. For Hopper, watching the prison disappear beneath cloud cover, the dominant emotion was not relief, but rage that it had taken 8 months, when it should never have happened at all. As Yuri's helicopter lifted from Soviet airspace, Hopper sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, and soaked in blood, both human and otherwise. Joyce's hand found his, the first gentle touch he had felt in 8 months. Through satellite phone, he heard Eleven's voice for the first time since the Starcourt explosion. She called him Dad. He had survived hell itself for that single word, but their reunion would have to wait. Hawkins was under attack from something worse than Russians or Demogorgons. A creature named Vecna was systematically destroying the town, and only Hopper's knowledge of the Upside Down might give them a chance. The flight from Russia back to the United States took 2 days, every hour bringing news of escalating horror in Hawkins. Hopper listened to reports of teenage deaths, dimensional rifts, and an ancient evil that made the Mind Flayer seem almost natural by comparison. He had escaped one prison only to fly directly toward another kind of cage, the responsibility of protecting a town that never seemed to escape the darkness. Homecoming rarely resembles the imagined return. Reality intrudes with blood and urgency. Hopper arrived in Hawkins during the early hours of March 27, 1986, stepping onto familiar ground for the first time in 8 months. The town he remembered had transformed into something resembling a disaster zone. A massive earthquake, the official story, claimed had torn through central Hawkins, creating fissures that swallowed buildings and displaced thousands of residents. The reality, known to those who understood the true nature of the town's history, was far worse. Vecna's murders had opened permanent gates, and these gates had merged into a single massive rift that split Hawkins apart. The reunion with 11 happened in the buyer's temporary residence, where refugees from the town's destruction had gathered. She saw him first standing in the doorway, transformed by his imprisonment. He had lost perhaps 40 pounds, his hair had grown long and unkempt, and his body carried new scars from arena fights and prison violence. For a moment, neither moved. Then she crossed the space between them, and he held his daughter for the first time since he had nodded to Joyce through that reinforced window. The embrace was brief. Circumstances did not allow for extended emotional processing. Max Mayfield, one of the kids from their extended group, lay in a coma at Hawkins Hospital, her body broken by Vecna's assault. She'd been his fourth and final victim, the murder that completed his ritual and opened the permanent gates. Elle had failed to save her, had watched her die and be revived by Lucas's desperate CPR, but Max's mind had not returned with her body. She existed in some space between death and life, unreachable even by Elle's powers. Hopper learned the situation through rapid briefing from multiple sources speaking over each other in their urgency. Vecna was Henry Creel, the first child Dr. Brenner had experimented on decades before. Elle, a boy with even greater powers, who had slaughtered his family and been banished to the Upside Down. He had survived there for years, transforming into something no longer entirely human, building power and planning revenge against both Brenner and the world that had imprisoned him. His murders of Chrissy Cunningham, Fred Benson, Patrick McKinney, and Max Mayfield had not been random teenage killings, but calculated ritual sacrifices designed to weaken the barrier between dimensions. The plan the group had developed involved multi-pronged assault. While Elle engaged Vecna psychically from a distance, another team would enter the Upside Down physically, through one of the gates and attack him directly in his lair, the old Creel house that existed in both dimensions. Hopper, Joyce and Murray were assigned to support from the primary gate at the old Hawkins lab site, fighting off any upside-down creatures that might interfere with the assault. Preparation time was minimal. They moved immediately, gathering weapons and supplies with the efficiency of people who had done this too many times. Hopper armed himself with the sword he had taken from Kamchatka, the weapon that had kept him alive in the arena, now serving a similar purpose. The familiarity of its weight in his hands was grimly comforting, a tool proven effective against the creatures they faced. The attack commenced after nightfall on March 27th. Multiple groups moved simultaneously, coordinating through walkie-talkies and hope. Nancy Wheeler, Steve Harrington, and Robin Buckley entered the Upside Down through a gate in the trailer of Eddie Munson, one of the teenagers falsely accused of the murders, who had volunteered to serve as distraction for the bat-like creatures that swarmed the dimension. Dustin Henderson and Lucas Sinclair supported from the real-world side. Elle, using sensory deprivation techniques, projected her consciousness to confront Vecna psychically while her physical body remained in a makeshift lab. Hopper, Joyce and Murray's role became rapidly more complex than anticipated. The gate at the former lab site had expanded dramatically, and creatures poured through in numbers suggesting coordinated assault rather than random emergence. Demobats swarmed in formation. Demodogs emerged in packs, and vines from the Upside Down began spreading aggressively through the ruins. They fought not a holding action, but a desperate attempt to prevent being overrun entirely. The battle raged across multiple locations simultaneously. Nancy's group reached the Creel house in the Upside Down and set the building ablaze, burning Vecna's physical form and weakening his psychic connection. Elle engaged him mentally, pouring everything she had into restraining his consciousness, preventing him from completing the ritual that would merge dimensions permanently. Hopper fought through waves of upside-down creatures, his swordwork mechanical from months of arena practice, each swing precise and brutally efficient. Victory came with terrible cost. Vecna was injured, but not destroyed, driven back, but not eliminated from existence. Eddie Munson died buying time for his friends to escape, torn apart by demobats, while ensuring the swarm did not pursue Nancy's group. Max survived physically, but remained comatose, her mind trapped somewhere even Elle could not reach. And through the center of Hawkins, the massive rift remained open, bleeding corruption into reality at a rate no one knew how to contain. 2 days after the battle, Hopper stood at the edge of the primary rift, watching ash-like particles drift from the Upside Down into the real world. The rift stretched across miles, dividing Hawkins into sections, transforming the landscape into something alien. Government officials had arrived, establishing quarantine protocols and evacuation orders, but their response felt inadequate for the scale of dimensional collapse occurring. The battle ended without clear victory. Vecna was injured, but not destroyed, driven back, but not eliminated. Max lived but remained trapped in a coma, her mind hidden somewhere even 11 could not reach, and through the center of Hawkins ran a massive scar where dimensional barriers had finally, catastrophically failed. The Upside Down was no longer a separate realm accessed through hidden gates. It was bleeding into reality, corrupting Hawkins from within. Hopper stood at the edge of the rift 2 days after the battle, watching ash-like particles drift through his town. He had survived Vietnam, New York, Sarah's death, Soviet prison, and Demogorgon fights, but he had never faced defeat quite like this. As Hawkins evacuated and the government established quarantine protocols, Hopper faced a truth more difficult than any monster. The Protector had failed to protect. The town was lost. The question remaining was whether he could save the people who still remained. Some battles are won with weapons, others with the simple choice to remain standing when everything falls apart. The destruction of Hawkins created a humanitarian crisis that transformed the town into a refugee camp almost overnight. The massive earthquake, as the government insisted on calling it, had rendered entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. Houses swallowed by the rifts, buildings condemned due to structural damage, and vast areas quarantined by federal authorities displaced thousands of residents. Those with means fled to relatives in other cities. Those without gathered at the high school gymnasium, which became the center of relief operations. Hopper coordinated rescue efforts, despite his technically complicated legal status. He had been declared dead 8 months earlier. His position as police chief dissolved, his property dispersed. Returning from that, declared death involved bureaucratic complexity that would take weeks to unravel, assuming anyone cared about paperwork during a crisis. For now, he simply worked alongside other volunteers, helping organize food distribution, locate missing persons, and provide security for the relief center. The reunions with old colleagues and townspeople who had mourned him ranged from joyful to awkward to overwhelmed by current circumstances. Chief Calvin Powell, who had assumed Hopper's position, simply handed him a radio and put him to work without comment about death or resurrection. The practical needs of the moment superseded the impossible questions about how he had survived. That conversation could wait until people had shelter and food. Joyce Byers worked beside him through these efforts, and their relationship shifted from the complicated dance they had maintained for years to something more solid. The near-death experiences, the rescue from Kamchatka, and the recognition that time was never guaranteed clarified what they had been avoiding. They were together now, officially and without pretense. No more failed dates or unspoken feelings. The crisis had eliminated space for that particular form of cowardice. Eleven spent her time at Hawkins Hospital, maintaining vigil over Max's comatose form. Elle blamed herself for Max's condition, convinced that if she had been faster, stronger, or more prepared, she could have prevented Vecna from completing his ritual. The guilt consumed her in ways Hopper recognized from his own experience with Sarah's death. He tried to counsel her, to explain that self-blame was natural but destructive, but his words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He had never forgiven himself for failing Sarah. Why should 11 forgive herself for failing Max? Will Byers demonstrated continued connection to the upside down, experiencing sensations when the dimensional corruption spread or intensified. The back of his neck would prickle, and he would know that somewhere nearby, another section of Hawkins was being consumed. This made him valuable as an early warning system, but also meant he could never fully escape the nightmare that had stolen years of his childhood. The upside down had marked him permanently, and that mark was both burden and tool. Mike Wheeler, Dustin Henderson, Lucas Sinclair, and the other kids processed trauma in their various ways. They had lost Eddie Munson, watched Max nearly die, and seen their town literally torn apart. The bonds between them had been forged in crisis repeatedly, and they functioned as a unit that adults could barely comprehend, let alone direct. Hopper found himself respecting their capabilities, even as he wished they had never needed to develop them. Nancy Wheeler continued investigating the broader conspiracy surrounding Hawkins, convinced that the government knew more than it acknowledged, and that the quarantine was merely the first stage of something more comprehensive. Her journalist instincts told her that the truth was being actively suppressed, and she was probably correct. Federal agents had flooded into Hawkins immediately after the earthquake, establishing perimeters and information controls that suggested pre-existing plans, rather than emergency response. Through all this activity, one reality became increasingly clear. Hawkins could not be saved, only contained. The rift was spreading slowly but steadily, the upside-down corruption advancing through soil and air in ways that defied conventional understanding. Scientists in hazmat suits took readings and shook their heads. Military personnel established fallback perimeters for when the current ones failed. The town that had been Hopper's refuge, his penance, and eventually his home, was dying from dimensional cancer. The decision to leave came through collective recognition rather than formal announcement. The Byers family, having lost their home to the rift, needed to relocate. 11 could not stay in Hawkins without being constantly reminded of her failure to protect Max. Hopper's legal status made remaining in town complicated at best. The logical solution presented itself through simple conversation. They would leave together, find a new location, regroup as the combined family they had become through circumstance and choice. Dr. Sam Owens, the government official who had helped legitimize Eleven's existence, reappeared to facilitate Hopper's legal resurrection. Paperwork was filed declaring his death erroneous, his survival confirmed, his identity restored for official purposes. The process that should have taken months was accomplished in days through bureaucratic shortcuts that Owens either authorized or simply ignored. Hopper found himself legally alive again, though the experience of dying and returning had changed him in ways no paperwork could address. Final preparations for departure took several days. Belongings were sorted from damaged homes, decisions made about what could be carried and what had to be abandoned. Hopper returned to his cabin in the woods, finding it remarkably intact compared to much of Hawkins. He walked through rooms where he had hidden 11, where they had fought and reconciled, where he had relearned how to be a father. The place held memories both difficult and precious, and leaving felt like severing connection to part of himself. Joyce helped him pack the essentials: clothes, documents, the box containing Sarah's belongings that he still carried after all these years. 11's room in the cabin was stripped methodically, her few possessions collected for transport. The cabin would remain standing probably, unless the upside-down spread reached this far out. Someone else might find it eventually, wonder about the reinforced locks and the makeshift homeschool setup, never knowing what battles had been fought within these walls. The convoy departed Hawkins on a grey morning in early April, passing through military checkpoints and past the quarantine zone perimeter. Hopper drove one vehicle, Joyce beside him, with 11, Will and Jonathan following in another. The town he had returned to as a broken man, the place he had protected through impossible odds, disappeared in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay uncertainty, a new location, combined family dynamics, and the knowledge that Vecna remained undefeated in the dimensional realm bleeding into their world. The convoy departed Hawkins on a grey morning, passing through military checkpoints and past the quarantine zone perimeter. Hopper drove one vehicle, Joyce beside him, with 11, Will and Jonathan following in another. The town he had returned to as a broken man, the place he had protected through impossible odds, disappeared in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay uncertainty, a new location, combined family dynamics, and the knowledge that Vecna remained undefeated in the dimensional realm bleeding into their world. But Hopper had learned something through Vietnam: Sarah's death, Soviet imprisonment, and interdimensional war. Survival was not about winning, it was about continuing, about standing up after each defeat, about protecting the people who remained when so many had been lost. The story of James Hopper, soldier, detective, father, and reluctant hero, had not ended. It had merely entered a new chapter, written in the language of aftermath rather than battle. What came next would depend on whether Vecna could be stopped, whether Hawkins could be reclaimed, and whether the family he had pieced together from tragedy and circumstance could survive what was coming. The greatest threats are those that refuse to end cleanly with victory or defeat. The location they chose for their new beginning remained deliberately vague in conversation, known only to those who needed to know. Somewhere away from Hawkins, but not so distant that they could not monitor the situation there. A place where Joyce could find work, where the kids could attempt normal schooling, where Hopper could exist without constant reminder of his failures. The specifics mattered less than the function: refuge that was not retreat, distance that was not abandonment. Settling into this new life proved more complex than simple geography. The Byers family and Hopper family, now merged through circumstance and choice, had to navigate domestic arrangements that none of them had fully anticipated. Joyce and Hopper, finally allowing themselves the relationship they had deferred for years, faced the reality that loving someone and living with someone demanded different kinds of courage. 11, Will and Jonathan adapted to a household structure that placed Hopper in a quasi-parental role he had not entirely earned through their eyes, even if he had earned it through Joyce's. Hopper found himself in the strange position of having no official occupation. He was not a police chief anymore, not formally employed, not technically qualified for much beyond law enforcement and survival skills. The government checks that came through Owens's continued assistance provided financial stability, but Hopper was not a man built for leisure or retirement. He needed purpose, needed work, needed something beyond domestic routine to occupy the parts of him that had been shaped by combat and crisis. His purpose crystallized around training. The kids, all of them, needed preparation for what was coming. Vecna had been injured, but not destroyed. The upside down continued spreading from Hawkins. Eventually, there would be a final confrontation, and when it came, everyone needed to be ready. Hopper began teaching them what he knew: hand-to-hand combat fundamentals, weapons handling, tactical thinking under pressure, how to function when terrified. The lessons drew on his Vietnam experience, his police training, and the brutal education of Kamchatka's arena. 11 worked to regain her powers, which had not returned after her confrontation with Vecna. The loss devastated her in ways that went beyond simple capability. Her powers had defined her identity since infancy, had been the thing that made her special and valuable and dangerous. Without them, she felt ordinary in ways that should have been liberating, but instead felt like amputation. Hopper watched her struggle with this loss, recognizing the parallel to his own experience losing Sarah. Identity built around a single element becomes fragile when that element disappears. Joyce maintained hope that Elle's powers would return with time and recovery, but medical understanding of psychic abilities was non-existent. They were operating from pure speculation and desperate optimism. Meanwhile, Will's sensitivity to the upside down continued, providing unwanted updates on its expansion. He could feel it spreading like infection through Hawkins, consuming the town in incremental advances that would eventually require new quarantine perimeters. The group maintained contact with those still in Hawkins through regular calls. Nancy Wheeler provided updates on the official response, which involved increasingly militarized containment and growing federal control. Dustin Henderson reported on the technical aspects of the rift, having befriended scientists studying the phenomenon despite his status as civilian teenager. Lucas Sinclair spent every possible moment at the hospital with Max, talking to her comatose form, convinced that some part of her could still hear him. Max's condition remained unchanged, clinically alive, neurologically unresponsive, existing in medical limbo that offered no clear prognosis. The doctors could keep her body alive indefinitely through mechanical support, but they had no framework for understanding where her consciousness had gone or how to bring it back. Elle visited her psychically in dreams, searching the void for Max's presence, finding only darkness and the echo of Vecna's malevolent attention. Through all these developments, Hopper maintained his role as the family's protector, though the nature of threats had evolved. He was not defending against immediate physical danger, but against the slower erosion of despair and helplessness. Keeping people focused on preparation rather than grief, on future action rather than past failure. This was perhaps harder than fighting monsters. Monsters could be confronted with weapons and rage. Existential dread required different tools entirely. The relationship with Joyce deepened through these months in ways their earlier attempts at romance had never achieved. They were building something beyond attraction or even love. They were creating partnership based on shared trauma, mutual respect, and the recognition that they functioned better together than apart. The romance was present but secondary to the more fundamental bond of being the adults holding everything together while the kids processed their own damage. Hopper's legal resurrection brought unexpected complications. He existed in official records again, which meant taxes and documentation and the tedious machinery of normal life. The government's assistance in restoring his identity came with unspoken expectations of future cooperation. Owens made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that Hopper's knowledge of the Upside Down made him a valuable asset. When the final confrontation came, when plans were made to address Vecna definitively, Hopper would be expected to participate. This expectation was not burden but purpose. Hopper had no interest in retirement or peaceful existence when Vecna remained alive, and Max remained comatose, and Hawkins continued dying. He would fight when called because fighting was what he did, what he had always done, what Sarah's death and Eleven's survival had taught him to do without question or hesitation. The only difference now was that he fought not alone, but as part of a family that depended on him to come back. Training intensified as months passed, and intelligence from Hawkins suggested Vecna was recovering from his injuries. The creature had retreated deep into the Upside Down after Nancy's group burned the Creel house, but Will's sensitivity indicated he was active again, moving through that dimension with purpose that suggested planning rather than mere survival. Whatever Vecna intended, it would require a response, and that response would demand everything they could bring to bear. Hopper sparred with the older kids, teaching them how to fight things larger and stronger than themselves. He took them through scenarios, drilled them on maintaining function under stress, pushed them harder than Joyce thought necessary, but not harder than he knew was required. 11 watched these training sessions with frustration, unable to participate in the way she once could have, relegated to physical combat training that felt inadequate compared to her lost psychic abilities. The waiting was its own form of torture. Hopper had spent his life responding to immediate crises, acting decisively when confronted with clear threats. This extended period of preparation, without defined timeline or certain outcome, felt wrong. He wanted the battle to come, wanted resolution one way or another, wanted to stop existing in this state of permanent anticipation. But Vecna would move on his own schedule, and all they could do was prepare and wait. James Hopper's story spans decades of loss, survival, and reluctant heroism. From the jungles of Vietnam to the frozen wastes of Kamchatka, from New York precincts to Hawkins police station, from the depths of addiction to the role of father, his path has been marked by the bodies of those he could not save and sustained by the few he could. Sarah's death created a void that nearly consumed him. 11's presence proved that voids can be refilled, that fathers can get second chances, and that monsters, whether human or interdimensional, can be fought. The Upside Down remains. Vecna waits. Hawkins bleeds darkness into the world. But Hopper has learned the essential truth of survival. You do not wait for threats to find you. You stand watch. You prepare. You protect those who depend on you. And when the final battle comes, you step forward, not because victory is certain, but because retreat is unthinkable. The watch continues. The father stands ready. And somewhere in the darkness, monsters learn what Jim Hopper has always known. The most dangerous opponent is not the strongest or the smartest, but the one who has already lost everything and found something worth dying for.